everybody. How y'all doing? And my tea is so hot. The tea is hot. My tea is so hot, and it is like scorching right now. Anyways, hi everybody. We're gonna be talking about how we actually get into the process of feeling traumatized inside of a relationship. I hope y'all are ready. We're gonna do a deep dive, y'all. I'm super excited about this live because this is like the crux of what I like to work on, the crux of what I like to talk about, what I like to educate about. So it gives me an opportunity to really just dive into my passion with y'all. And I'm hoping that, this can be something that helps you to feel more settled about like your knowledge base about traumatic relationships. And I'm so excited that you're here. I saw that two people were already like logged on, just waiting for a little while. So thank you for waiting. It didn't tell me like who it was, but it did say people are waiting for the live. So that makes me, really happy that y'all are in just such great anticipation for this topic, for this live, for this conversation. I want to make it interactive. I was going to try and do like a poll. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to ask y'all questions. So y'all might see like a poll in the chat somewhere that I was trying to create for y'all. But it was, to just get you thinking about the concept of traumatic relationships and to really expand your knowledge about this area. Because I think when it comes to trauma, we oftentimes forget how many layers there are to trauma, how many ways we can actually be in a traumatized self in reference to relationships. It can be one of those experiences that we like kind of discount, don't talk about enough to actually unpack it and see all the layers of it. So I'm here to unpack and see the layers with y'all. Well, to show you the layers that I know and that I see in my work. So I'm hoping that you grabbed your tea. I'm hoping that you are ready to like get into this learning journey with me. And if you are, let me know like what kind of tea you decided to go for today. Um, and if you didn't get to go for your tea, like I hope you can like just grab your phone and carry it into the kitchen and like brew up a little something and like just sit with me and we can vibe and chat and I can, tell you all things relationships and trauma. Um, so let's get into it, right? The reason why I wanted to really kind of get into this topic in particular, apart from the things that I've mentioned to y'all, is because there is something about knowledge when it comes to mental health, when it comes to trauma, when it comes to um, relationships, that whenever we are better equipped with information, it gives us an opportunity to show up to life, to relationships, to ourselves in a much better way. And we can honor ourselves, we can honor our experiences in a more authentic way whenever we are having a lot of conscious thinking and conscious thought around these experiences rather than we're like just subconsciously kind of dissociatively walking around the world. So my hope is that I can equip you with enough information and knowledge that you're gonna feel like, you know what, yeah, this is healthy. This is good for me to know. Um, so yeah. So for any of you who are drinking tea, if you could pop in like what kind of tea you're drinking, I'm really curious. I always want to know. So the tea that I am drinking right now, this is from Nature's Batch. Um, they have an IG. I don't think they have any other platform, but it is rose and mint, and I've got a little there's some dried fruit in there, and it's just divine. So cheers to you all. Um, Thank you for joining. I see one iced tea, Cali girl. It's Cali. It's hot in Cali. Okay, I hear you. Iced tea is completely welcome. I'm down for it. It's actually hot in where I am here in like the New York Metro, but I love my hot tea. So, um, yeah. So I see that y'all see the poll that I created. So the poll actually says that, oh, so I don't know if y'all can see the poll. So, anyways, y'all, if y'all can't see the poll, don't you worry, because I did the poll and then I took it back and I was like, yeah, I don't want to do it. So I don't know if you can see it or if you can't. But don't worry if you can't, because my purpose here is to actually equip you with the information that I was going to cover in the poll. And then we can like maybe just like pop whatever answers you may have inside of the chat. So all of you know, let's kind of start from the beginning, because I think it can be helpful to just understand how relationships traumatize you from like step one, right? Um, so relationships themselves tend to traumatize people because they exhibit abusive behavior. And I say that in order to help us to understand the full context of what happens in a relationship that caused a trauma. Traumatizing behavior happens in the relationship. And a relationship, so that we can really open it up, can be a relationship with anybody. So whenever we're talking about traumatized relationships or relationships that are in trauma, people automatically go to intimate partners. And intimate partners are not the only people that can traumatize you. Actually, quite frankly, any person that is a fellow human can cause you trauma. And they can create emotional wounds that can last for the extent of your life. However, there are certain people that can cause deeper wounds because of their positioning in your life. So I'll get into that. So, one example of the people that can hurt you are family members. And this is something that people, it resonates with a lot of people. Some family member hurt them. Sometimes it's their parents. Sometimes it's another family member. And what happens when it's a family member is that that's supposed to be home. When we're learning how to feel, when we're actually growing up and we're learning what an emotion is and we're experiencing those emotions for the first time, those emotions start getting matched to hurtful experiences from the people that are raising us or the people that are in our lives as we're growing up. And so when you're simultaneously learning an emotion and also being hurt within your emotions, that can create a pairing that can last an entire lifetime. And I start with family for that reason, because very often what tends to happen, especially with people that have been traumatized in childhood, is that they have that experience of feeling like their identity was formatted and created in trauma. And that can make it so that your the fabric of who you are is actually um, it reflects trauma through and through, and it can make it feel like it's really hard to extract. I'm not going to say that it isn't, but because I work with individuals that have complex trauma and trauma survivors and individuals who have to work through intergenerational trauma and very like heavy deep things, and those individuals have the capacity to actually transition from their pain. So I do believe that there is space to do that even if you grew up in trauma. However, it's important to understand that there is a pairing that happens when you're developing who you are, your core self, your authentic self, and that authentic self is also matched with hurt. And if anybody's feeling me out there, let me know. Send me like a like or a heart or something, so that I know, like, okay, yeah, this resonates. But family is foundational, right? Like we grow up in families, most of us, right? Or we grow up in familial environments. And if those familial environments have an element of toxicity, have an element of relational trauma that is just a part of the way that people engage in that family system, there's an element of dysfunction, there's an element of chaos that is going to create a pairing with your personality that's going to be really hard to extract later on in life when you're trying to do the healing work. Yeah. So I'm getting some hearts and some 100s. Yeah. So I think this resonates with folks, and I feel like for a lot of the people that have been born into or raised into trauma, that tends to be something that hits home and it resonates right away. This also happens when a person, now being an adult, they're transitioning from being in a home where they grew up in trauma into being in a home where they now embody trauma. Here's the generational piece, right? They embody trauma and now they're also a part of a traumatic process with their own children. Many people, especially cycle breakers that carry a lot of guilt, carry guilt because they feel like, I wish I could have done this work earlier. I would have known about this a lot earlier so that I didn't transfer that pain over to my kids. And now their kids, let's say that they're already like adults or maybe even teenagers, are now, in some way like rebellious towards the parent or have animosity towards the parent. And there's a some sort of a friction that happens between the parent and the child or the adult child. Now that parent is feeling re-traumatized now by the relationship that they have with their child. Of course, the child is, and the adult child is also feeling traumatized, right? But there is a cycle that continues. And so now we have, the experience where trauma has become so much of the norm and so embedded in the fabric of this family that now you have not only the trauma that surfaced when the person was developing their identity, but the trauma that now has become the identity of their children, and also the way that they engage in their relationship with their adult children. So it becomes cyclical, and very often that can be really hard for people to sit with because they have to sit with a lot of difficult emotions, most notably shame and some guilt. And shame and guilt can be incredibly immobilizing emotions. And so a lot of the work that we do, which I'll get into in a little bit, but a lot of the work that we do does centralize shame. It does centralize the ways that we move out of a frozen state, and into a state where we're activating ourselves into a cycle breaking process. Are y'all still with me? Because I feel like I'm getting really heady. I could get like very nerdy about this. So let me know if y'all are still with me. Shoot me some hearts and, whatever y'all do on these social mediums. But I just want to know if y'all are out there. So that's just family, y'all. There's a whole host of categories that I want to get into. The other category that I wanted to transition into was intimate partners. And I know I started off with saying it's not just them, but it is a very big category of how people get hurt. And very often, intimate partnerships tend to be a reflection of the relationships that we have growing up. So, if the relationships that we've had with our parents, family members, if those relationships had an element of toxicity or hurt or dysfunction or chaos within them, there is a high chance that we're going to feel like that is the norm and that's how relationships are supposed to be, and not really catch the red flags before going into an intimate partner relationship that can actually be hurtful and damaging and loop us into a toxic cycle that can even be abusive. So that's a lot. And thank you for the hearts. That's a lot, but it's real. A lot of people that are looped into these toxic cycles often say like, I don't even know how I didn't realize that this was happening. I don't know how I didn't see the signs. Well, you're not going to be able to see the signs if what you're seeing in front of you is what you believe to be the normal way of being in a relationship. There is no sign to see when what you're seeing in front of you does not reflect to you what a red flag would be. It looks like a green flag because that's the way that love was modeled for you. Love was modeled with pain and harsh words and sometimes physical violence, right? And so, if all of that was modeled to you as a norm, you're never going to be able to see that that isn't the norm because that's what you believe love ought to be. So, a lot of people, tend to get into this headspace of like, how did I not know? What is wrong with me? I should have known. Like, there's a lot of that language floating through a person's mind that has been through these cycles. And in reality, very often, you're just really enacting what you know or reenacting it. Yeah, 100. Yeah. And, the unfortunate part about that is that very often, let's call it fortunate actually. I don't know, we don't need to contextualize it even, but very often people come into a place where they want to start healing after they've been through a traumatic relationship with an intimate partner where they're like, this just, the volcano just like erupted, everything like blew over. And that's when they finally realize, wait a second, I know this is what I've seen my entire life, but this doesn't feel good. So it can't be the way that things are supposed to be. And that's when people usually have an aha moment, which is why whenever I think, especially, me, when I say like traumatic relationships, people default to romantic relationships, but that's not the only type of relationship. It's just that very often that's when people have their moment where they're enlightened and they realize this is not status quo. This is not okay. So it's that's why I say like maybe it's a good thing. Maybe we don't need to say it's a good thing, but if it gets a person to a point of healing, at least it offered enlightenment. That's why sometimes I think I had like this one post, a hot tea post where the tea was hot, where I said, like, keep the lesson, not the person, right? Sometimes a person comes into our lives to offer us a lesson on something that is going to be really important for us to hold on to. And we need that message because we've been operating as if chaos is status quo for the entirety of our lives until someone comes and like just completely like creates complete destruction. And with that destruction comes a rebuilding and an alchemizing of our lives. And as painful as that process can be, sometimes it is that moment that offers us an opportunity to break free and break the cycle. I think I'm going to sip some tea now, y'all, because I've been talking a lot. So if there's anything y'all want to say, pop it in the chat and let me know. Like, um, if there's any thoughts, any questions, if it feels like it's resonating to talk about family members and intimate partners, and these aren't the only categories that I'm going to get into. I love the green hearts, by the way, Kasha. Mm, thank you for those. This tea is so good. This tea is so good, y'all. Um, that just made my whole soul happy. Okay, so let's get into the other categories. The other ones are, so there's friendships. And friendships, that's the one we often miss. We often miss friendships. Y'all could have friendships in your lives that can be profoundly toxic and really unhealthy for you. And many times a friendship, again, like intimate partners, can be a reflection of what you believe relationships should look like. And so you don't realize that there are red flags even within the friendships that you hold. So you'll be in a friendship and that person can be manipulative, put you down, um, make you feel like your recollection of the events isn't really how things went. If anybody knows what that is, pop it in the chat. When somebody denies your reality of or your recollection of the events, what is it that they're doing? Friends do that too, y'all. Like it's not just intimate partners, it's not just parents. Friends can actually be out here gaslighting. Thank you. And so it's really important to understand that the ways in which a friend can show up in your life that can actually reignite that cycle of abuse and make it so that you are feeling unwell. You could have a super healthy relationship with your intimate partner. You can like come from a home where there was a lot of love. And maybe there was a bit of chaos, maybe some dysfunction, but it wasn't like profound. And you can get looped into a toxic cycle with a friend, and that can be your very first introduction into toxic and traumatic relationships because that friend had such a strong pull and hold on you, and you didn't even realize it because you weren't looking for the red flags or for the signs. Why? Because this was a friend and it wasn't like someone that you were in a relationship with and in an intimate way. So I just want to put that out there because I think it is so often that we miss the signs on acquaintances and friends that can also have these ways in which they can engage us in a traumatizing cycle. And when you don't know the signs, you can be easily looped in, and then you're right in it, right? So that's that. The other category is a little bit tends tends to be like maybe like a little bit more subtle, and the reason being is because very often, there are like, what do we call them? There are rules in place. And the category that I'm going to get into is like the workplace category. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the words like my boss is toxic, or I have a narcissistic supervisor. And this is basically someone who's your superior, or someone who has like some sort of authority over your job. And all of a sudden, this person is hurtful and damaging and manipulative, and micromanages you and berates you, right? And now you're in a cycle that, more often than not, unless you leave your job or unless there are proper protocols in place for you to actually say this person is really toxic, can someone do something about it, you're kind of just there taking it and being in the cycle. So, y'all, colleagues, same thing. Although colleagues that are lateral to you tend to have a little bit, you feel like you have a bit more agency over what you can do in reference to that. Not always, right? But when it's someone superior to you, if it's a boss, if it's a manager, supervisor, very often than not, you feel an immense amount of pressure, and it feels like you don't have a lot of agency and a lot of control over the situation. And sometimes what can happen to folks is that they become deeply depressed in these experiences. Why? Because, well, for one, because the experience itself just is terrible. But secondly, because especially for individuals who are trauma survivors from like childhood trauma, it brings up that hierarchical dynamic of like, this person is bigger than me and they have power over me. Before, it was like maybe like a parent or an older sibling or cousin or a family friend or somebody, right? Now it's like the reenactment of that is happening in the workplace, and it triggers a person. I had a boss who wrote me up all the time. I tried to stick it out, but it ended up in the hospital. Yeah, like, I think we underestimate the impact that having a toxic boss or having toxic colleagues can have on us. Because think about it, like, especially in the US, but I think just worldwide, right? We spend a lot of time at work. So this is kind of like a second home for us. Wherever we spend our time at work tends to be, the second most place where we spend our time for most of us. And so if most of your time you're spending in a toxic environment, you're going to feel the depths of that in your soul. You're going to feel so fractured. You're going to feel anxious. You're going to feel depressed. All of the elements of trauma are going to start surfacing. You're going to feel triggered. So, not to be underestimated, right? Just because it's the workplace and it's not like childhood trauma or, an intimate partner that, could have escalated a certain way, this still hurts. And sometimes it feels inescapable because you still have to, you need income to live. And so very often people stick it out because they either don't have options. The pandemic made it so that a lot of people lost their jobs. So there's a lot of, you know, a lot less, that there's just like, it's just convoluted. It's all over the place. However, it minimizes choice. And when people don't feel like they have the choice and the autonomy to act on their own behalf, what are they going to do? They're going to suppress, they're going to shrink, they're going to depress. And so that tends to happen very often in workplace environments where there's an element of toxicity and there's a hierarchy. I don't envy anybody in that position. And it's unenviable. I just don't have a better term than that. And that feels really appropriate. Okay, let's get into our next category. What was it? Community members. Community members are people that are not any of the other categories, right? So not necessarily like family members, not individuals that are our own children. They're not intimate partners. They're not colleagues, and bosses or anything. So they fall in the other category, I guess you can say. But these people are still very influential in our lives. So community members could be like a family friend, right? Who was supremely toxic and brought that toxicity into your family environment. It could be somebody in your place of worship, right? And that person can have a toxic element or can be abusive, and they're a community member. Um, Gosh, it can be so many people, but it really falls into the category of anybody else, basically. However, like, the people that are in the community do have some elements of connection to us. And so that means that if they were a neighbor, if they were a babysitter, like whoever they may have been, they still had an opportunity to tap into your life in a traumatizing way and make it so that you're you still had some emotional injury and that you're feeling the weight of that. And when we're talking about toxic relationships, globally, the categories of family, of intimate partners, of friends, and community are all categories that we should be considering. It shouldn't just be one. So the reason why I started this live with that is because I wanted people to understand the depths of your pain can come from one of these categories. It can come from all of these categories. It can be scattered. It can be two of them, three of them. Most people that are trauma survivors have more than one. And that's why I put the poll up, because I was like, I'm really curious what people will have to say. But maybe, y'all can just pop it in the chat. Like for me, it was family. For me, it was friends. For me, it was all four, right? I think that that can give us a little bit of an impression of like, okay, so where was the hurt situated, right? And this is completely optional, of course. But it can be helpful to think about it in that way, because our minds and our hearts tend to go directly to where the most hurt happened. But it is very likely that the hurt was compounded by the different relationships in your life that were traumatizing. And what is incredibly unfortunate is that people that are traumatized in relationships tend to be re traumatized. So it happens more than once, more often than not. And I hate that about, people that have had to undergo that emotional kind of hurt. Reason being is because there's already a tenderness, right? So the more that you're hurt, the more tender. The more you hurt, the more tender. And it just like becomes like this like compounded hurt and pain that just like suppresses and minimizes you more and more and more. Just it's really unenviable. But there are ways around, this kind of experience. And I am gonna get into those pieces in a bit, because I do want people to understand like there are ways to help yourself transition from a place of having traumatic relationships injure you and suppress you in life to living a life that is abundant and healthy in your relationship world. So to have healthy relationships, to have them with yourself, to have them with others, there are ways. I do teach some of these ways in my course that I have. Did I pin my course? I didn't pin my course. Goodness gracious. I should have been done that. Um, but anyways, the course it's on all of my profiles and it's on my website. You just click on courses and you'll see it there. And there's an opportunity to sign up right now because the enrollment is live. But I think that that also gives us an opportunity to talk about, well, what can healing look like, which is what I talk mostly about, in the course. But let me get into some of the signs, because that's important too. And it's oftentimes like what people tend to miss. I'm just gonna like make sure that I tag the course and if anybody's like interested on here. But some of the signs, they're very variable. I don't want people to self-diagnose. I don't want people to like be like, that's me. I just want this to offer you some context so that you can see like what's possible in terms of how you can be in pain in reference to these kinds of situations. The biggest thing that I tend to see, the biggest thing that there is a difficulty with trusting others and a difficulty with trusting yourself. So that tends to be like the biggest like aspect of being in traumatized relationships or traumatizing relationships, that establishing meaningful relationships that have the element of trust beyond that initial traumatizing relationship gets more and more complicated as you move along. And what happens with that mistrust is that it feeds a cycle. If you're mistrusting, then you reflect that mistrust in a number of ways. You scream, you yell, um, you withdraw. Like there's so many things that people do when they can't trust. And what is that doing? That's just feeding the dysfunction. They're going back into relationships where people may have like a strong reaction to that. And then like they're just in it, right? But trust is so elemental to healthy relationships. And it is one of the biggest things that's disrupted in the process of feeling the hurt from relationships. There's also like, for a lot of folks, is like a vivid recollection of what happened. So some people tend to be like really stuck in like a thought loop. Some of these thought loops are called like intrusive thoughts. Some of them are flashbacks. Some of them are nightmares. It varies. Some people have all three. Some people have one. There's different severity levels, right? And so this is why it's always really helpful and essential to consult with a mental health professional when it comes to anything related to trauma, because it can be very individual, and it's really important to understand the level of severity, what's needed in the process of like being able to heal from these aspects of trauma. But that is a very, very big part of it too, where a person is just stuck in a thought cycle around what happened, stuck in a thought cycle that feeds their shame. And so they're almost kind of like going back into the experience over and over again. And that can be so distressing. So the other piece that I wanted to cover in terms of what can happen is basically what happens right after those thought loops continue, which is that a person enters like, they enter like a deep, dark fear. It's like this fear and this worry that this is their life, and like this is status quo. There's anxiety about entering new relationships because can those relationships also be traumatizing? There's a lot of avoidance of other relationships because they can be triggering. Some people become serially in relationships and can't be alone. So there's so many ways that people express their trauma, but these are just like some of the like common ones. But that deep fear tends to feed either how a person like almost like magnetizes towards others and cannot let go, or how they completely push others away. So there's all of that. And then there's like the big one, which is shame, right? We have fear, and fear is still a mobilizing emotion. So you're still like kind of acting based on fear. Shame is shut down. Shame is like, I can't function in this. I don't want to. There's like dissociation. There's complete like I'm just not here, right? Shame does that. It can be very immobilizing for folks. Because my family hurt me. I'm reading some of the comments here. It's difficult to trust anybody. Yeah, I hear you saying I usually sabotage, which is a very big element of like how we show up to relationships. We sabotage them because we don't believe that anything good can happen to us in relationships, so we create the bad, right? We have to take the onus for what we do too. So thank you for honoring that for yourself, for saying like, yeah, this is something that I do. I bring to the table, this self-sabotaging. Why? Because, you know, my internal belief is that I don't deserve any better. It's very hurtful to like be in that process. Like it hurts people deeply because then they're like, I did this to myself, and that causes deeper shame. There's also the element of suspicion, the hypervigilance, the feeling like nobody can be trusted. Like, the other shoe is gonna drop. This person's like gonna, do something that's gonna hurt me. There's always that. Do you know how exhausting that is, y'all? I'm looking at the screen because I'm serious about this one. It is exhausting, okay? Like people that have to always be in that hypervigilant state are deeply, deeply exhausted to their bones. And if you're that person, I feel you, you know, I really feel you because it's hard. It's hard out here. And possible to get out of like that process and those cycles. But I just want to honor how difficult it is to to sit in that hypervigilance day in and day out. So I just want to honor that for folks that are listening. Um, y'all, I could talk about this forever. I'm just like, I'm sitting here babbling. I really wanted this to be a little bit more engaging because I'm like, but I also want to like, educate. So y'all let me know, like, how is this feeling? How is it resonating? Does it feel like, something that like you're like, yeah, I'm trying to read the comments here too, to get a sense of what y'all are saying. But if you are feeling like this is resonating, just hit whatever like button there is on this platform, or like, shoot me some hearts so I know you're still here. Um, So I do have a video that I recently did on the 7 stages of trauma bonding that I wanted to note on this live, because I don't want to reiterate that. I don't want to be like sound like a broken record. Just go back to that video on my YouTube and you can actually learn how people get sucked into a cycle, especially when they're, especially like later in life, like, but really kind of through and through, right? Like people can be born into environments in their families where trauma bonding is just, that's just the nature of the family, right? And some people, just get sucked into cycles that are trauma bonding like later in life. So just go back to that video, check it out, see if, if anything resonates. I think there's a lot of good nuggets in there. um, but really the thing that happens after that cycle of abuse and that trauma bonding situates itself in your relationship is that there you start basically like experiencing yourself as having lower sense of self-worth, not feeling adequate in relationships, not feeling like you can have a healthy relationship, so doing the self-sabotaging that we talked about, um, being very isolated. That's a big thing for people. Also, being a little bit more reckless um, in relationships, just to like be destructive because you just don't know what to do with all of that energy that's been left over in your heart. There's all of that, right? So there's a lot of ways that people, enact their hurt. And whenever people come to me, like um, I used to have like a healing community where I did a lot of like weekly courses. So for anybody who used to be a part of my healing community, shouts out to you. Now I've transformed that into my course platform. So now I have my first course that's like a more comprehensive 5 week course where I'm going to be, covering healing traumatic relationships. But um, I used to talk about all of these pieces. I used to talk about the inner child and childhood trauma and the ways in which that then transforms into traumatic experiences later in life. The ways that, intergenerational trauma is very much implicated in the ways that we show up into relationships, all of that, right? So now this 5 week course is going to be covering all those pieces, but in a more comprehensive, more expansive way. How relational trauma starts to be reflected in different kinds of relationships, like we talked about today, right? The 4 categories, and how those categories, there are people that are in all four, there are people that are in two, and how that can be like so versatile based on the person. But also how to engage in the healing work, which is the most important piece. How to heal from the process of having been like in these traumatic relationships, and how to transition into a life that has essence and abundance and feels like it's reflective of your cycle breaking spirit rather than your traumatized self, right? So it's important to cultivate that in a deep and profound way, so that the ways that you navigate the world from here on out is from a psychologically safe place rather than a psychologically wounded place. And so I'll be covering a lot of that more comprehensively there. I'll also throw some nuggets of pieces of information here and there, like on YouTube, and of course on hot tea and tea therapy sessions, like all of it, right? Like I want all of you to be informed. It's not just through the course. I want information to just be everywhere. But if you want a deeper dive, my course is definitely the way to go. Um, So, if anybody out there has had any experience where traumatizing relationships, you know, has been in their home and it continues to be, um, there's a national suicide hotline and the national hotline for domestic violence that is really, really important for people to have an understanding that those are places where you can dial in and you can contact those folks and they can help you to transition from those relationships or to help you in a state of crisis. So I just want to note that because it's really important, and sometimes it isn't that easy for a person to just switch off and say I'm out of here. Sometimes it can be a lot more difficult, even if it's with family. Sometimes families can like have like this volcanic eruption whenever somebody says I'm out, no more. Families can blow up and it can be really even re-traumatizing. So I just want to make sure that people have the resources that they need out there. um, Y'all, I promised myself that I would do these lives for 45 minutes. I'm going to stay true to that. Like a true tea therapy session, 45 minutes, that's all we have. But if there are any thoughts or questions that y'all want to like pop into chat, let me know, and I'll just be sure to be mindful of those.